Hey guys, tonight we imagine you're standing at the foot of a mountain that's on fire. Not with a forest fire, but with a divine, terrifying blaze that reaches into a sky black with smoke and clouds. The ground beneath your feet won't stop shaking, and a sound like 1,000 trumpets is blasting, so loud it feels like your bones are rattling apart. You can't get any closer because a boundary has been set, and to cross it means instant death. This isn't a disaster movie. This is Mount Sinai, and the creator of the universe is personally handing down the terms and conditions for his people. Frankly, given the sheer, overwhelming power on display, you probably wouldn't survive the orientation session, let alone the 40 years of wandering that come next. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. But only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. I always love to see where you're all listening from. Go ahead and drop your city or country and the local time in the comments below. It's a wonderful way to feel connected, knowing we're all sharing this story from different corners of the world. Our story doesn't begin with a golden box. It begins with a people, a nation of traumatized refugees, really, standing at the edge of the known world, blinking in the harsh desert sun. They are the Israelites, and for 400 years, they have known nothing but the lash of the whip, the weight of Egyptian bricks, and the bitter taste of slavery. Their God, the God of their ancestors Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, had seemed a distant memory, a whispered story told by weary mothers to sleepy children. But then, in a series of earth-shattering, nation-breaking events we now call the plagues, this forgotten God roared back into their lives. He had crushed the gods of Egypt, turned the Nile to blood, and in a final, terrible night, passed over their marked doorposts to claim the firstborn of their oppressors. They had walked out of Egypt not as beggars, but laden with the gold, silver, and fine linens of their former masters, a form of back pay for centuries of stolen labor. They had walked through the Red Sea on dry ground, a miracle so profound it would become the defining story of their nation, only to watch that same sea crash down upon the entire Egyptian army, the most feared military force in the world. Now they are free. But what does freedom even mean when you've never known it? What do you do when the only life you've ever understood is gone, and ahead of you lies nothing but sand, rock, and a terrifying pillar of fire by night God? They are camped at the base of a mountain. Not just any mountain. This is Sinai, also called Horeb, the mountain of God. And it is here that God has called them to a meeting. You have to understand, in the ancient world, gods were local. They were tied to a specific city, a particular river, a sacred grove. The idea of a god who could dominate the empire of Egypt and also be present in this remote wilderness was, in itself, revolutionary. But the Israelites are about to learn that their God is not just powerful. He is also terrifyingly holy. Moses, their leader, a man who grew up a prince of Egypt, but is now a humble shepherd, a man who stammers, but is chosen to be the voice of God, ascends the mountain into a thick, dark cloud. The people are told to wait, to consecrate themselves, to wash their clothes, and to not, under any circumstances, even touch the mountain. A boundary is set up. Any person, or even an animal, that crosses it will be put to death. The message is painfully clear. There is a vast, uncrossable chasm between the divine and the human, between the holy and the common. For days, the mountain rumbles. Then, on the third day, the divine spectacle begins. Thunder that isn't just a sound, but a physical force. Lightning that illuminates the jagged peaks in strobing, terrifying flashes. A thick cloud covers the mountain, and from it, a trumpet blast, a shofar, grows louder and louder until it's a deafening, continuous roar that seems to shake the very atoms of their being. And the mountain itself, it's covered in smoke, as if a great furnace is raging within it, because the Lord has descended upon it in fire. The entire mountain trembles violently. The people are, to put it mildly, petrified. They are trembling with a primal fear that goes beyond a simple scare. This is the terror of mortals in the presence of the infinite, the unclean in the presence of absolute purity. They cry out to Moses, "You speak to us, and we will listen. But do not let God speak to us, or we will die." They understand their inadequacy. They know they cannot survive direct contact with this level of holiness. Moses, in this moment, becomes their mediator, their go-between. He is the one who can enter the consuming fire and not be consumed, who can stand in the gap between a holy God and a fearful people. Moses enters the cloud, and for 40 days and 40 nights, he is gone. Up on that mountain, in the heart of the fire and the storm, he is receiving the law, the Torah, the instructions for how this ragtag group of former slaves is to become a holy nation, a kingdom of priests. He receives the foundational principles of civilization, how to treat one another, how to administer justice, how to care for the poor and the foreigner, and how to worship. And at the heart of this law are the 10 Commandments, inscribed by the very finger of God onto 2 tablets of stone. These aren't just rules, they are the terms of a covenant, a sacred treaty between God and his people. "I will be your God," he says, "and you will be my people." It is a marriage proposal on a national scale, and it is in this same series of divine briefings that Moses receives the blueprint for a portable sanctuary, a tent temple called the tabernacle. God, it seems, does not want to remain distant and terrifying on a mountaintop. He desires to come down, to travel with them, to pitch his tent, as it were, right in the middle of their camp. "Let them make me a sanctuary," God says, "that I may dwell in their midst." This is a staggering concept. The transcendent creator of the cosmos wants to be immanent, to be near, to be a neighbor. The plans are breathtakingly specific. Every loop, every hook, every curtain, every post is described in meticulous detail. But at the very heart of this sanctuary, in its most sacred and inaccessible room, the Holy of Holies, will be a special piece of furniture. It is the first object described to Moses, the centerpiece around which everything else is designed. It is a box, a chest, in Hebrew, an Aaron, We call it the Ark of the Covenant. This ark is to be the physical manifestation of God's presence, the footstool of his throne on earth. And it is to hold the most precious thing they own, the 2 stone tablets of the covenant, the testimony. The ark will be a constant, tangible reminder of their relationship with God and the promises he has made. But while Moses is on the mountain, receiving these beautiful, intimate plans for God to dwell with his people, a disaster is unfolding down below. 40 days is a long time to wait in the desert. The smoke and fire on the mountain, once a source of awe, now seems a distant, silent threat. Their leader is gone. Has God abandoned them? Was Moses consumed by the fire? The old fears creep back in, the slave mentality that needs something tangible, something it can see and control. The people gather around Aaron, Moses' brother, the one left in charge. Their request is a return to what they know, a regression to the familiar patterns of Egypt. Come, make us gods who shall go before us, they demand. As for this Moses, the man who brought us up out of the land of Egypt, we do not know what has become of him. It is a vote of no confidence in both Moses and his invisible God. They want a God they can carry, a God they can look at, a God that doesn't speak in thunder and hide in a terrifying cloud. Aaron, in a moment of catastrophic weakness, capitulates. Perhaps he feared for his life, or perhaps his own faith was wavering. He tells them to bring him their golden earrings, the very gold given to them by the Egyptians, the gold that could have been used for the sanctuary. He melts it all down in a fire, and using a tool, fashions it into the shape of a young bull, a calf. In ancient Egypt and Canaan, the bull was a common symbol of strength, fertility, and divinity. It was a comfortable, recognizable image. It was a God you could understand. When the people see it, they are ecstatic. These are your gods, O Israel, who brought you up out of the land of Egypt, they proclaim. It is a stunning act of spiritual amnesia. They attribute the miracles of the plagues, the parting of the sea, the very freedom they now enjoy, to this lump of inert, man-made metal. Aaron builds an altar before it, and they have a great festival. They offer sacrifices, they eat and drink, and then, the text says, they rose up to play. This is likely a euphemism for the kind of debauched, fertility cult rituals they would have witnessed in Egypt. They have traded the holy, awesome presence of the living God for a pagan rave party at the foot of his holy mountain. Up on Sinai, God knows exactly what is happening. His tone with Moses is one of white-hot anger and profound hurt. Go down, he says, for your people, whom you brought up out of the land of Egypt, have corrupted themselves. Notice the language, your people, not my people. It's the language of divorce. He tells Moses about the calf and declares his intention to destroy them all and start over with Moses alone, to make of him a great nation. The covenant, it seems, is already broken beyond repair. But here, Moses shines. He ceases to be just a leader and becomes a true intercessor. He stands in the gap, pleading for his foolish, rebellious people. He doesn't make excuses for them. Instead, he appeals to God's own character and reputation. he reminds God of his promises to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. And he makes a brilliant, strategic point. Why should the Egyptians say, "With evil intent did he bring them out, to kill them in the mountains, and to consume them from the face of the earth"? In other words, what will the neighbors think? Your reputation is at stake. And incredibly, the Bible says that the Lord relented from the disaster that he had spoken of bringing on his people. Moses descends the mountain, his face probably still glowing with a faint remnant of the divine glory, carrying the 2 stone tablets inscribed by God's own hand. As he and his aide Joshua get closer to the camp, they hear the noise, not the sound of war, but the sound of singing and revelry. And then they see it, the golden calf, and the people dancing around it. The sight is so grotesque, so offensive, that Moses is overcome with a righteous fury. The tablets in his hands, these beautiful, holy objects representing a sacred bond, now seem like a mockery. In a powerful, symbolic act, he hurls the tablets to the ground at the foot of the mountain, shattering them. The covenant, so recently made, lies in pieces, just like their faithfulness. He then takes the calf, burns it in the fire, grinds it into a fine powder, scatters it on the water, and makes the Israelites drink it. It's a humiliating, visceral lesson. He forces them to ingest their sin, to absorb the bitter taste of their own idolatry. The aftermath is brutal. A painful reckoning takes place, and about 3,000 men are killed. The camp is purged, and a somber silence falls. The party is over, but the relationship with God is in tatters. How can he possibly dwell among such a fickle and stiff-necked people? His holiness would surely consume them. Moses sets up a temporary tent of meeting far outside the camp, and anyone who sought the Lord had to go out there. When Moses went out to the tent, all the people would stand at their own tent doors and watch him, a sign of their separation from God's presence. The easy intimacy God had planned, with his tent right in their midst, seems impossible now. Yet again, Moses intercedes. He goes back to God, pleading on behalf of the people. "If I have found favor in your sight," he prays, "please show me now your ways, that I may know you in order to find favor in your sight. Consider, too, that this nation is your people." He is asking God to reconsider the divorce, to take them back. In a moment of incredible boldness, he says, "If your presence will not go with me, do not bring us up from here." He understands that the promised land is worthless without the presence of the promiser. It's the presence of God that makes them distinct, not a plot of land. God agrees. "My presence will go with you, and I will give you rest." The relationship is restored, but it will be different. It's a covenant renewed, tempered by the painful memory of failure. God commands Moses to cut 2 new stone tablets, just like the first, and to come back up the mountain. And this time, when God reveals himself to Moses, it's not just with fire and thunder, but with a declaration of his own character. The Lord, a God merciful and gracious, slow to anger, and abounding in steadfast love and faithfulness, keeping steadfast love for thousands, forgiving iniquity and transgression and sin, but who will by no means clear the guilty. The covenant is renewed. And now, the plans for the tabernacle and the ark are no longer just a blueprint for a future ideal. They are an act of breathtaking grace. Despite their monumental failure, God still wants to dwell with them. The instructions are given again, this time with a new urgency, a new sense of purpose born from a near-fatal mistake. The people have seen what happens when they try to invent their own way to God. Now, they are ready to do it His way. Moses comes down from the mountain, the new tablets in hand, and his face is shining so brightly with the reflected glory of God that he has to wear a veil. He gathers the people and relays the instructions. The first order of business is to collect the materials. This is not to be a tax or a mandatory tithe. It is to be a contribution, a freewill offering from a willing heart. Let every man whose heart moves him is the command, and the people's hearts are moved. A current of generosity and enthusiasm sweeps through the camp. People start bringing their treasures. The women who had been so quick to give their earrings for the idol now bring them, and their bracelets and rings, and all their golden ornaments for the sanctuary. They bring silver and bronze. They bring fine linens in blue, purple, and scarlet dyes that were incredibly expensive and rare, symbols of royalty and the heavens. They bring goat hair for the outer curtains, and tanned ram's skins and fine leather. And those who had it brought acacia wood. Imagine the scene. A steady stream of people from every tribe and every family lining up to give. The very wealth they carried out of Egypt, a symbol of their liberation, is now being repurposed, consecrated for the dwelling place of their liberator. The artisans, the skilled workers, come forward, and at their head are two men singled out by God Himself, Bezalel of the tribe of Judah and Oholiab of the tribe of Dan. The text says something remarkable about Bezalel. It says God has filled him with the Spirit of God, with skill, with intelligence, with knowledge, and with all craftsmanship to devise artistic designs, to work in gold, silver, and bronze, in cutting stones for setting, and in carving wood, to work in every craft. This is an astonishing statement. It elevates craftsmanship to a divine gift, a spiritual endowment. The ability to make something beautiful, to work with your hands, is presented here as a gift from the Holy Spirit, just as much as prophecy or leadership. Bezalel and Oholiab set up a workshop, and Moses entrusts them with the offerings. And the people keep giving. They give so much, in fact, that the craftsmen eventually have to go to Moses and say, "The people are bringing much more than enough for the work that the Lord has commanded us to do." It's the only fundraising campaign in history where the organizers had to tell the donors to please stop giving. So Moses issues a proclamation throughout the camp. Let no man or woman do anything more for the contribution for the sanctuary. The people were restrained from bringing more because they had more than enough. Their hearts, once set on a golden calf, are now overflowing with devotion to the true God. Now the sacred work can begin. And the first and most important object they will build is the ark. The instructions from Exodus 25 are followed to the letter. First, the wood, acacia wood. In Hebrew, shittim wood. This is not a grand or imposing tree like the cedars of Lebanon. It's a tough, gnarled, thorny tree that survives in the harsh, arid conditions of the Sinai Desert. Its wood is dense, hard, and resistant to decay and insects. It's a humble, resilient wood. Many see a beautiful symbolism here. The acacia wood represents humanity, or perhaps even the incorruptible humanity of the future Messiah. It's sturdy, but it's still of the earth. Bezalel and his team would have selected the best pieces, cutting them into planks and carefully measuring them. The dimensions are precise: 2.5 cubits long, 1.5 cubits wide, and 1.5 cubits high. A cubit was a common ancient measurement, roughly the distance from a man's elbow to the tip of his middle finger, usually standardized to about 18 inches or 45 centimeters. So the ark would have been approximately 3 feet 9 inches long and 2 feet 3 inches wide and high. It's not enormous like the towering idols of Egypt. It's a chest, a box. It's portable, intimate even, large enough to be substantial and hold the stone tablets, but small enough to be carried by a few men. Once the wooden box was constructed, the next step was the gold, pure gold. Bezalel was instructed to overlay the box, inside and out, with pure gold. This would have been a painstaking process of hammering gold ingots into incredibly thin sheets or leaves, and then meticulously applying them to every surface of the wooden chest, leaving no wood visible. The result would be a box that appeared to be solid gold, but at its heart was the humble acacia wood. Again, the symbolism is rich and powerful. The wood, representing the earthly, is completely covered by the gold, representing the divine, the holy, the glorious. It speaks of the meeting of heaven and earth, the divine presence condescending to dwell in an earthly vessel. Around the top edge of the box, a molding or crown of gold was to be fashioned, like a decorative border, signifying royalty and honor. This was no ordinary box. It was a royal treasure chest for the King of Kings. Next came the practical considerations for transport. This object was going to be the centerpiece of a mobile sanctuary for a people on the move. It needed to be carried. So, 4 rings of pure gold were to be cast and attached to the 4 feet or corners of the chest. Then, 2 long poles were to be made, also from acacia wood, and completely overlaid with gold. These poles were to be inserted through the rings on the sides of the ark. And here, a crucial instruction is given. The poles shall remain in the rings of the ark. They shall not be taken from it. This is a hugely important detail. It means the ark was perpetually ready to be moved. But more than that, it created a permanent, built-in boundary. No human hand was ever to touch the sacred chest itself. It could only be handled via these poles. This reinforced the concept of God's dangerous holiness that the people learned at the foot of Sinai. You approach God with reverence, with respect, through the prescribed means. To touch the ark directly would be to cross a sacred line with lethal consequences, as one man would later find out to his sorrow. Now we come to the most important part of the ark, the lid. It is described separately and has its own name. It's not just a cover, it's the focal point of the entire structure. In Hebrew, it is the captivated. This word is notoriously difficult to translate. Some versions say mercy seat, others atonement cover. The root word is kafar, which means to cover, but in a spiritual sense, as in to cover over sin or to atone. So this lid is, functionally, the place of atonement. Unlike the main body of the ark, the mercy seat was not wood overlaid with gold. It was to be fashioned from one solid, single piece of pure gold. Imagine the amount of gold required, and the sheer skill of the goldsmith to hammer and shape it into a slab measuring 3 feet 9 inches by 2 feet 3 inches. This solid gold lid, this mercy seat, was where God's presence would be focused. It was, symbolically, his throne. When God says he will meet with Moses and speak to him from above the mercy seat, this is the spot he is referring to. But the mercy seat was not just a flat lid. On top of it, and forged from the very same piece of gold, were 2 magnificent figures, the cherubim. Now, it's essential to erase from your mind any image of chubby, winged bobbies with little bows and arrows. That's a much later, Renaissance-era invention. Biblical cherubim, as described in visions by the prophets Ezekiel and Isaiah, are something else entirely. They are powerful, awe-inspiring celestial beings, guardians of the holy. They are often depicted as hybrid creatures, sometimes with 4 faces, a man, a lion, an ox, and an eagle, multiple wings covered in eyes, and legs like burnished bronze. They are not cute, they are formidable. They are the beings who were placed at the entrance to the Garden of Eden with a flaming sword to guard the way to the tree of life after Adam and Eve were exiled. They are attendants to the very throne of God in the heavens. Bezalel's task was to sculpt 2 of these cherubim, one at each end of the mercy seat, facing each other. Their wings were to be spread upward, arching over the mercy seat, overshadowing it. This posture of their wings creates a protected, sacred space. It visually encloses the throne, and their faces were not to be looking up or out, but were to be turned downward, gazing upon the mercy seat. Think about the visual this creates. These 2 powerful, angelic guardians are in a posture of perpetual reverence, their gaze fixed on the place of atonement. It's as if all of heaven is captivated by what happens on this golden slab. It is here, between the cherubim, that God promised to dwell. It is here that, once a year on the Day of Atonement, Yom Kippur, the high priest of Israel would enter the Holy of Holies alone, into this terrifyingly sacred space. He would sprinkle the blood of a sacrificed animal onto the mercy seat to make atonement, to cover the sins of the entire nation for the year. The cherubim would, in a sense, bear witness to this profound act of mercy and forgiveness. The entire design of the ark screams holiness, majesty, and the breathtaking provision of atonement. Once the craftsmanship was complete, the final assembly could take place. Moses takes the 2 new stone tablets, the testimony, the written record of the covenant, and he places them inside the acacia wood and gold chest. This is the ark's primary, foundational purpose, to be the container for the covenant. It's why it is called the Ark of the Testimony, or the Ark of the Covenant. Its very presence is a reminder of the promises God made and the standard of holiness he requires. It holds the marriage contract, so to speak. Then the solid gold mercy seat, with its magnificent cherubim, is carefully placed on top, closing the chest. The golden poles are slipped through the golden rings, ready for transport. The masterpiece is complete. Bezalel, Oholiab, and their team of spirit-filled artisans have followed every divine instruction perfectly. They have created not just a beautiful object, but a vessel pregnant with meaning, a focal point for the faith of a nation. This ark was then placed inside the innermost room of the newly completed tabernacle, a room called the Most Holy Place, or the Holy of Holies. This room was a perfect cube, separated from the rest of the sanctuary by a thick, heavy veil woven with blue, purple, and scarlet yarn, and embroidered with images of cherubim. The veil was another boundary, another reminder that one does not simply stroll into the presence of a holy God. And when all the work was finished, when the tabernacle was erected for the first time, and the ark was placed within its sacred chamber, the final seal of divine approval was given. The cloud that had covered Mount Sinai, the very cloud of God's presence, descended and covered the tabernacle. And the glory of the Lord, a brilliant, radiant, and overwhelming light, filled the sanctuary so completely that even Moses himself could not enter. The terrifying God on the mountain had kept his promise. He had come down. He was now dwelling in their midst. The blueprint from heaven had become a reality on earth. The Ark of the Covenant, this humble wooden box covered in divine gold, now sat in silent, awesome splendor at the heart of the camp, the throne of the invisible King, ready to lead his people on the long journey ahead. For a time, there was a stillness in the camp of Israel. The sounds of hammering and weaving had ceased, the flurry of generous giving had subsided, and the tabernacle, God's tent, now stood complete at the very center of their temporary city. It wasn't just a geographic center. It was their new spiritual and existential center. Imagine waking up in your tent in the morning. The first thing you see is not the rocky horizon of the Sinai, but the pristine white linen walls of the sanctuary courtyard, and rising from within it, the beautifully colored fabrics of the tabernacle itself. And over it all, a cloud. Not an ordinary cloud, but a unique, singular pillar of cloud that seemed tethered to the most holy place, right above where the Ark of the Covenant sat in its silent, veiled majesty. This cloud became the nation's compass, its clock, its commanding officer. During the day, it was a column of cloud, a divine parasol providing shade from the relentless desert sun. At night, it transformed into a pillar of fire, a holy beacon that illuminated the entire camp and warmed them against the cold desert air. It was a constant, undeniable, 24/7 reminder. God is here. His presence was not an abstract theological concept. It was a physical reality that dictated the rhythm of their lives. When the cloud remained settled over the tabernacle, they rested. They went about their daily lives, tending flocks, teaching their children, settling disputes, all within sight of that divine pillar. But when the cloud lifted, when it began to move, a signal would ripple through the camp. Silver trumpets would sound, their clear notes cutting through the desert air, and a city of well over 1 million people would begin the monumental task of breaking camp. This was a spectacle of organized chaos. Tents were taken down, possessions were packed, and livestock was gathered. The entire nation got ready to follow their invisible king. But how did they move the most holy object in their possession? How did they transport the very throne of God? This was not a casual affair. It was a process governed by a strict and solemn ritual, a holy choreography designed to instill a profound sense of reverence and awe. The responsibility for the tabernacle and its furnishings was given to the tribe of Levi, who were set apart for God's service instead of receiving an inheritance of land. The Levites were divided into 3 main clans: the Gershonites, the Merarites, and the Kohathites. The Gershonites handled the curtains and coverings, the Merarites the heavy framework, the posts, and the bases. But the clan of Kohath was given the highest and most perilous honor. They were entrusted with carrying the most sacred items: the table of showbread, the golden lampstand, the altar of incense, and the Ark of the Covenant itself. Even the Kohathites, however, could not simply walk into the Holy of Holies and pick up the Ark before they were allowed to enter. Moses' brother Aaron, the high priest, and his sons had to perform a specific preparatory rite. Imagine the scene. The pillar of cloud has lifted, the trumpets have sounded. A hush falls over the central court of the tabernacle. Aaron and his sons, robed in their sacred vestments, would be the only ones to enter the holy tent. They would pass through the first chamber, the holy place, and then, with what must have been trembling hearts, they would pass behind the great, thick veil into the perfect darkness of the Holy of Holies. Their first act was to take the veil itself, the very curtain that separated the holy from the most holy, and use it to cover the Ark of the Covenant. This was the first layer of protection, wrapping the Ark in the boundary that normally kept everyone else out. On top of the veil, they would place a covering of durable leather, perhaps from a porpoise or a dugong, to protect it from the elements. And finally, over all of that, they would spread a solid blue cloth. This pure blue cloth, the color of the heavens, would be the only thing visible as the Ark traveled. It was a block of celestial blue moving through the drab colors of the desert, a patch of sky on earth, signaling to everyone that the king was on the move. Only after the Ark was completely shrouded, its holiness veiled from human sight, would the Kohathites be summoned. They would enter the now dismantled Holy of Holies, avert their eyes from the other holy furniture, and approach the Ark. They would not touch the Ark itself. To do so was death. They would stoop, lift the long golden poles onto their shoulders, and hoist the sacred burden. And so, the ark would begin its journey, carried on the shoulders of men, a testament to its supreme importance. It was not to be carted like common luggage. It was to be borne with honor. When the entire camp was ready, the procession would begin in a precise, ordained order. At the very head, leading the entire nation, went the Ark of the Covenant. The text of Numbers says it would go out before them on a 3-day journey to seek out a resting place for them. It's a beautiful image. The Ark is like a divine scout, going ahead into the unknown, into potentially hostile territory, to find a safe place for God's people to pitch their tents. It was a tangible expression of God's guidance and provision. And as the Kohathites lifted the ark to their shoulders and took those first steps out of the camp, Moses would cry out with a prayer that would become the marching anthem of Israel, a prayer of faith and dependence. Arise, O Lord, and let your enemies be scattered, and let those who hate you flee before you. It was a declaration that any enemy they faced was not their enemy, but God's. And when the cloud finally settled, and the ark was brought to its new resting place in the center of the new camp, Moses would pray again, a prayer of welcome. Return, O Lord, to the 10,000 thousands of Israel. It was a plea for God to settle once more, to be present and at peace in the midst of his people. For 40 years, this was their life, following the cloud, led by the ark, but the journey through the wilderness was far from a peaceful parade. It was a period of intense testing, of rebellion, and of learning hard lessons about the nature of the God who traveled with them. On one occasion, the people grew tired of the miraculous manna God provided every morning and began to crave the meat they remembered from Egypt. Their grumbling grew into a widespread complaint. Their desire for comfort began to outweigh their gratitude for freedom. The presence of God in their midst, symbolized by the ark, did not prevent them from falling into discontent. A more direct challenge to the holy order surrounding the ark came from a man named Korah, a fellow Levite from the clan of Kohath. He, along with several other influential men, instigated a rebellion against Moses and Aaron. Korah's complaint was, on the surface, pious. He declared, "All the congregation is holy, every one of them, and the Lord is among them. Why then do you exalt yourselves above the assembly of the Lord?" He was essentially arguing for a democracy of holiness, challenging the specific roles God had assigned to the priests and the Levites. He and his followers felt that they, too, deserved the privileges of the priesthood, the right to offer incense and draw near to God. This was a direct assault on the very system of sacred boundaries that the ark represented. It was a refusal to accept that God had established a specific order for how he was to be approached. The confrontation was dramatic. Moses commanded Korah and his 250 followers to take their own fire pans or censers and offer incense before the tabernacle, the same as the priests would do. It would be a divine officiated test to see whom God had truly chosen. The rebels gathered at the entrance to the tent of meeting, and the glory of the Lord appeared to the whole congregation. God's presence, which dwelled above the ark, was about to render a terrifying verdict. God threatened to consume the entire assembly, but Moses and Aaron interceded, pleading for God to punish only those who had sinned. God then commanded the congregation to move away from the tents of the rebels. Moses declared that if these men died a natural death, then God had not sent him. But if the earth opened its mouth and swallowed them alive, then everyone would know they had despised the Lord. As soon as he finished speaking, the ground beneath Korah and his chief co-conspirators split open. A great chasm appeared, and they, their families, and all their possessions went down alive into the pit, and the earth closed over them. At the same time, a fire blazed out from the presence of the Lord and consumed the 250 men who were presumptuously offering incense. The message was horrifically clear. God's holiness is not to be trifled with. The sacred order he established around his presence, centered on the ark, was absolute and non-negotiable. Proximity to God's glory was a place of immense blessing, but also of immense danger for those with rebellious hearts. Perhaps the most pivotal moment in the wilderness journey, however, came at a place called Kadesh Barnea, on the very border of the Promised Land. After 2 years of travel, they had arrived. Moses sent 12 spies, one from each tribe, to scout out the land. They came back with a mixed report. The land was indeed flowing with milk and honey, a place of incredible abundance. But they reported the cities were heavily fortified, and the inhabitants were giants, powerful descendants of Anak. We seemed to ourselves like grasshoppers, they said, and so we seemed to them. Fear, like a virus, swept through the camp. 10 of the 12 spies gave a bad report, and the people's faith, which had been nurtured by daily miracles, completely collapsed. They wept and wailed, and once again, they longed for the familiarity of Egypt. Would that we had died in this wilderness, they cried. Why is the Lord bringing us into this land to fall by the sword? They even talked of appointing a new leader to take them back to slavery. This was the ultimate act of betrayal. Standing at the threshold of their inheritance, they refused to trust the God who had brought them this far. They saw the giants in the land as bigger than the God who dwelled between the cherubim on the Ark the Covenant, contained within that golden chest, was based on faith, and in that moment they had none. The judgment was swift and devastating. God declared that this entire generation, everyone 20 years and older who had grumbled against him, would not enter the Promised Land. They would wander in the wilderness for 40 years, a year for each day the spies were in the land, until all of them had perished. Their children, the very ones they feared would be taken as plunder, would be the ones to inherit the land. In a fit of remorse and presumption, a group of Israelites decided to defy the verdict. We have sinned, they admitted, but now we will go up and fight. They decided to invade the land on their own terms, without God's blessing. Moses warned them, "Do not go up, for the Lord is not among you." And he gives a crucial detail. Neither the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord nor Moses departed from the camp. They went into battle without the Ark, without the tangible presence of God leading them. The result was a catastrophic defeat. They were driven back and slaughtered by the Amalekites and the Canaanites. It was another brutal lesson. The ark was not a magic talisman that worked automatically. Its power was inseparable from the presence of the God who commanded their obedience. Victory was impossible when they marched out of step with him, and so they wandered. For 38 more years, they journeyed through the desolate wilderness, a generation walking toward their own graves. The Ark of the Covenant went with them, a constant, silent witness to both God's faithfulness and their failure. Finally, that generation passed away. A new generation, born in the desert, who had known nothing but life under the cloud and fire, now stood where their parents had stood, on the banks of a river, at the edge of the promised land. Moses, their great leader, was also gone, having died on Mount Nebo overlooking the land he would never enter. Leadership had passed to his chosen successor, Joshua, a man of unwavering faith, one of the 2 spies who had believed God decades earlier. Their first obstacle was the Jordan River, and it wasn't a gentle, trickling stream. It was springtime, the time of the barley harvest, when the snows from Mount Hermon would melt and the Jordan would swell, overflowing its banks and turning into a raging, impassable torrent. There were no bridges, no ferries. For an entire nation, with their women, children, and livestock, it was an impossible barrier. Joshua, now in command, receives his instructions from God. The plan would be a powerful echo of the Red Sea crossing that had defined their parents' generation. It would be a miracle designed to establish Joshua's authority and to prove to this new generation that the same God who delivered their parents from Egypt was with them now. The strategy centered entirely on the ark. Joshua addresses the people. He tells them to consecrate themselves, to prepare for a miracle. For tomorrow, he declares, the Lord will do wonders among you. The next morning, he gives the order. The priests who carry the Ark of the Covenant are to go first. They are to walk directly into the raging river. Imagine the faith required of those priests. This wasn't a calm sea parting before them. This was a violent, muddy flood. They had to take that first step into the water while it was still a torrent, trusting that God would act. A space of about 2,000 cubits, a little over half a mile, was to be kept between the ark and the people. This ensured that everyone could see the ark clearly, their eyes fixed on the symbol of God's presence leading the way. The priests, bearing the ark on their shoulders, marched down the muddy bank towards the water's edge. The entire nation watches in hushed anticipation. And then the moment of truth. As soon as the soles of the priests' feet touched the water, the miracle happened. Upstream, miles away at a city called Adam, the water flowing down from the north stopped. It began to pile up in a great heap, a wall of water held back by an invisible hand. The riverbed below that point emptied, and a wide, dry path opened up before them. It was the Red Sea all over again, a miracle for a new time, a new generation. But the miracle wasn't over. The priests carrying the ark didn't just cross over. They walked to the very middle of the riverbed and stood there on dry ground. They stood firm, a living monument, holding the ark of the Lord of all the earth, as the entire nation, every man, woman, and child, walked past them and into the promised land. The ark literally held back the waters of chaos and judgment, creating a safe passage for God's people. Before they finished crossing, Joshua commanded one man from each of the 12 tribes to go back to where the priests were standing and retrieve a large stone from the middle of the riverbed. These 12 stones would be set up as a permanent memorial, a teaching tool for future generations. When their children would ask, "What do these stones mean?" they could tell the story of how the waters of the Jordan were cut off before the Ark of the Covenant. Once everyone was safely across, Joshua commanded the priests to come up out of the Jordan. And the moment their feet touched the western bank, the waters of the Jordan returned to their place, rushing back into the channel and overflowing the banks as before. The way was closed. They were in the land. There was no going back. Their first target in this new land was the city of Jericho. It was an ancient, powerful, and seemingly impregnable fortress. Its massive double walls were the pinnacle of Canaanite military engineering. From a human perspective, a siege would be long, costly, and likely fatal for a nomadic army with no siege engines. But God's battle plan was, to put it mildly, unconventional. There would be no battering rams, no scaling ladders, no catapults. There would only be marching. The instructions given to Joshua were bizarre. For 6 days, the army of Israel was to march around the city one time. The procession was to be in a specific order. First, a contingent of armed men. Then, 7 priests carrying 7 trumpets of ram's horns or shofars. Then, the centerpiece of the entire parade, the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant. And finally, a rear guard. And there was one more rule: absolute silence. No one was to utter a word, not even a battle cry. The only sound was to be the steady tramp of feet on the dusty ground, and the eerie, continuous blast of the 7 shofars. Imagine being a citizen of Jericho, peering over the walls at this spectacle. The first day you see this massive army appear, your heart pounds, but they don't attack. They just walk. They circle your entire city, this golden box in their midst, with priests blowing trumpets, and then they just go back to their camp. It would be unnerving. The second day, they do it again, and the third, and the fourth. For 6 straight days, this silent, ritualistic parade circles your city. The psychological pressure must have been immense. It was a war of nerves, a battle fought in the realm of the spirit before a single sword was drawn. The Ark was at the center of it all, a declaration that this was not Israel's siege, but God's. The commander of the armies of heaven was making his rounds. Then came the 7th day. The instructions changed. On this day, they were to march around the city not once, but 7 times. Picture the scene: the sun rising, the army assembling. They begin their slow, silent march, once around, twice, a third time. The tension builds with each lap. The people of Jericho watch from the walls, their initial confusion likely turning to dread. The priest's lungs must have been burning from blowing the shofars for so long. The soldiers' feet must have been weary. Finally, after the seventh circuit was complete, the procession halted. A heavy silence fell over the plain. Then Joshua gave the command, "Shout, for the Lord has given you the city." At that moment, the 7 priests blew a final, long, powerful blast on their trumpets, and the entire army of Israel let out a single, massive roar, a great shout that came from the depths of their being. And the Bible says that when the people shouted and the trumpets blew, the walls of Jericho fell down flat. Not just a breach, not a crack. The massive fortifications simply collapsed into a heap of rubble, leaving the city completely exposed. The ark had not emitted a death ray or some supernatural energy beam. Its presence signified that God Himself was fighting for Israel. The victory at Jericho was a pure miracle, achieved not by military might, but by obedience to a strange command and faith in the God whose presence the ark represented. It was a powerful lesson for the beginning of their conquest. But lest they think the ark was a magical good luck charm that guaranteed victory, their next battle provided a harsh reality check. Their target was a small city called Ai. After the stunning success at Jericho, the Israelites were overconfident. Joshua's spies reported that Ai was a minor threat, and only a small detachment of 2,000 or 3,000 men would be needed. So they sent a small force, but they were shockingly defeated and chased from the city gate, with 36 Israelites killed. The effect on the nation's morale was devastating. The Bible says the hearts of the people melted and became as water. Joshua and the elders of Israel were distraught. They tore their clothes, put dust on their heads, and lay on their faces before the ark of the Lord until evening. Joshua's prayer is one of confusion and despair. Why did you bring us across the Jordan only to deliver us into the hands of our enemies? He asks. What will you do for your great name? God's response is sharp and direct. Get up. Why have you fallen on your face? Israel has sinned. He reveals that the problem isn't with His power or His presence, but with the people's disobedience. Someone had violated the command to devote everything in Jericho to destruction. They had stolen some of the devoted things and hidden them in the camp. God declares that He will not be with them anymore until this sin is purged from their midst. The entire nation was contaminated by the secret sin of one man. A solemn process of divine forensics begins. The tribes are brought forward, then the clans, then the families, and finally the individuals. The lot falls on a man named Chan. When confronted, he confesses. He had seen a beautiful Babylonian garment, 200 shekels of silver, and a bar of gold among the plunder of Jericho. He coveted them, took them, and buried them in the ground inside his tent. The stolen goods are recovered, and Achan and his entire family, who were likely complicit, are stoned and burned in a valley that would forever bear his name, the Valley of Achor, which means trouble. Only after the sin was dealt with, after the covenant was honored, did God give Joshua the strategy to defeat Ai. This time, they were successful. The lesson was seared into their national consciousness. The presence of the ark was not a substitute for personal and corporate holiness. God's power flowed through them when they were obedient to the covenant that the ark contained. Disobedience short-circuited that power and led to defeat and shame. With these foundational victories and lessons behind them, Joshua did something remarkable. He paused the military campaign to fulfill a command Moses had given them long before. He gathered the entire nation, men, women, children, and even the foreigners living among them, in the heart of the newly conquered territory, in a valley between two mountains, Mount Gerizim, the mountain of blessing, and Mount Ebal, the mountain of cursing. In the valley between the two mountains stood the priests carrying the Ark of the Covenant. Half of the tribes stood on the slopes of Gerizim, and the other half on the slopes of Ebal. And there, in the presence of the ark, Joshua read aloud every word of the law of Moses, first the blessings for obedience, which echoed from the slopes of Gerizim, and then the curses for disobedience, which resounded from the barren peak of Ebal. The entire nation responded, Amen, formally and publicly recommitting themselves to the covenant in their new land. The Ark of the Covenant stood there in the center of it all, the silent, golden witness. It held the very words they were affirming. Its journey across the desert was over. Now, its journey through the history of a settled nation was about to begin. A journey that would see it revered, captured, neglected, and ultimately brought to a glorious resting place. After the whirlwind of conquest under Joshua, a kind of weariness seems to have settled over Israel. The land was largely subdued, but not entirely cleansed of its former inhabitants. The tribes settled into their allotted territories, and the unifying leadership of Joshua gave way to a fractured and often chaotic period we call the time of the Judges. For several centuries, Israel existed as a loose confederation of tribes, bound by a common ancestry and a common covenant, but with no central government, no king to unite them. The refrain of the book of Judges, repeated like a sorrowful chorus, tells the whole story. In those days, there was no king in Israel. Everyone did what was right in his own eyes. It was an era of cycles, a dizzying rotation of sin, subjugation, repentance, and deliverance. The people would forget their God, embrace the idols of their Canaanite neighbors, and soon find themselves oppressed by a foreign power. Then they would cry out to the Lord, who would raise up a judge, a military and spiritual leader to save them. But as soon as that judge died, the cycle would begin all over again. Throughout much of this turbulent time, the Ark of the Covenant, along with the tabernacle, resided in a town called Shiloh. It was the nation's central shrine, the place where the tribes would gather for their major festivals. It should have been the spiritual heartbeat of the nation, the anchor of their faith. But as the centuries of moral relativism wore on, even the heart began to show signs of disease. The reverence and holy fear that had characterized their parents' generation had curdled into a kind of lazy, complacent familiarity. Our story picks up here in Shiloh, near the end of this long, dark period. The high priest is a man named Eli. He is an old man, 98 years old, and his eyesight is failing him. He has served the Lord his whole life, but he has grown weary and perhaps a little too comfortable. He represents a priesthood that has become passive and ineffective. He's not a wicked man, but his weakness, particularly his failure as a father, will have catastrophic consequences for the entire nation. Eli has 2 sons, Hophni and Phinehas, who were priests by birthright. The Bible gives a blunt and damning assessment of them. They were worthless men who did not know the Lord. This is a shocking statement about priests serving at the very sanctuary of God. For them, the priesthood was not a sacred calling. It was a family business, and they were embezzling from the owner. They treated the holy offerings of the people with contempt. According to the law, when someone brought a sacrifice, the priest was entitled to a specific portion of the meat after the fat, God's portion, had been burned on the altar. But Hophni and Phinehas were greedy. They would send their servant to stick a large, 3-pronged fork into the boiling pot and take whatever it brought up for themselves. Worse yet, they would demand the raw meat, with the fat still on it, before it was offered to God, threatening to take it by force if the worshiper refused. They were, in essence, robbing God, putting their own appetites before the Lord's portion. Their sin was not just gluttony. It was a profound act of blasphemy, treating the holy sacrifices as nothing more than a barbecue. Their corruption didn't end there. They also took advantage of their position to sleep with the women who served at the entrance to the tent of meeting. The very place that was meant to be a sanctuary of holiness had been turned into a den of exploitation and immorality by its own leaders. Eli heard the reports. He knew what his sons were doing. He would give them a feeble, half-hearted rebuke, saying, "Why do you do such things? No, my sons, it is no good report that I hear." But he did nothing to stop them. He didn't remove them from office. He honored his sons more than he honored God, and this failure to act, this passive tolerance of evil in a holy place, was sealing his family's doom. Into this spiritually bankrupt environment, a glimmer of hope appears in the form of a small boy named Samuel. He was the child of a miraculous birth, given to his barren mother, Hannah, in answer to a desperate prayer she had made right there at the sanctuary in Shiloh. In gratitude, she had dedicated him to the Lord for his entire life. And so, little Samuel, weaned from his mother, grew up in the tabernacle, ministering before the Lord under the tutelage of old Eli. He was a stark contrast to Hophni and Phinehas, a faithful, obedient child serving amidst corruption. The Bible makes a poignant note about this time. The word of the Lord was rare in those days. There was no frequent vision. God had grown quiet. The spiritual lines of communication were filled with the static of sin. But God was about to break his silence, not by speaking to the high priest, but to the little boy. One night, as Samuel was sleeping in the tabernacle near the ark of God, he heard a voice calling his name. Thinking it was Eli, he ran to the old priest, who told him he hadn't called. This happened 3 times. Finally, the aging Eli slow as he was, realized what was happening. He understood that the Lord was calling the boy. He instructed Samuel to go back, and if he heard the voice again, to say, "Speak, Lord, for your servant hears." Samuel did as he was told, and God spoke. But the message was not one of comfort. It was a terrifying word of judgment against the house of Eli. God declared that he was about to do something in Israel that would make the ears of everyone who heard it tingle. He confirmed a prophecy that had been delivered earlier by an unnamed man of God, that Eli's family line would be cut off from the priesthood, that Hophni and Phinehas would both die on the same day, and that their descendants would be reduced to begging. The next morning, a terrified Samuel was forced to relay this dreadful message to his mentor. To his credit, Eli received the news with a kind of resigned piety. It is the Lord. Let him do what seems good to him. Years passed. Samuel grew, and the Lord was with him, and all of Israel, from Dan in the north to Beersheba in the south, recognized that Samuel was a true prophet of the Lord. The stage was now set for the prophecy against Eli's house to be fulfilled. The catalyst was war. The Philistines, a technologically advanced and militarily aggressive people who had settled on the coastal plain, were a constant thorn in Israel's side. They had a monopoly on ironworking, giving them a significant advantage in weaponry. A battle broke out between Israel and the Philistines near a place called Ebenezer. In the initial clash, Israel was defeated, and about 4,000 of their soldiers were killed. Back in the camp, the elders of Israel engaged in some flawed theological reasoning. They asked the right question: why has the Lord defeated us today? But they came to the wrong conclusion. Instead of looking inward, instead of repenting for the corruption in their leadership and the sin in their own hearts, they looked for an external solution, a quick fix. Let us bring the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord here from Shiloh, they decided, that it may come among us and save us from the hand of our enemies. Their thinking was dangerously superstitious. They had come to see the Ark not as the holy throne of the living God who demanded their obedience, but as a kind of national mascot, a magical box that could be deployed in a crisis to guarantee victory. They wanted the power of the Ark without the presence of the God of the Ark. They were treating it exactly like the pagan nations treated their idols, as a tool to be manipulated for their own benefit. So they sent messengers to Shiloh, and Eli's 2 sons, the corrupt priests Hophni and Phinehas, accompanied the Ark of the Covenant on its journey to the battlefield. When the Ark entered the Israelite camp, the soldiers let out a massive shout, a roar so loud that the earth itself seemed to shake. It was a shout of misplaced confidence, of relief that their secret weapon had finally arrived. The Philistines in their own camp heard the noise and were terrified. What does this great shouting in the camp of the Hebrews mean? They wondered. When they found out that the Ark of the Lord had come into the camp, panic set in. They knew the stories. A God has come into the camp, they cried. Woe to us, for nothing like this has happened before. Woe to us. Who can deliver us from the power of these mighty gods? These are the gods who struck the Egyptians with every sort of plague in the wilderness. Their theology was flawed. They thought of the Lord as one of many gods. But their fear was genuine. They had a greater respect for the Ark's history than the Israelites did at that moment. But this terror did not lead them to surrender. It galvanized them into a desperate, fight-for-your-life courage. Their leaders rallied them with a stark choice. Take courage and be men, O Philistines, lest you become slaves to the Hebrews, as they have been to you. Be men and fight. They knew that defeat meant subjugation, and they resolved to die on their feet rather than live on their knees. The battle that followed was an unmitigated disaster for Israel. Their great shout and their lucky charm were no match for the desperate fury of the Philistines and the righteous judgment of God. The Israelite army was routed. 30,000 foot soldiers were slaughtered on the field. Hophni and Phinehas, the worthless priests, were both killed, just as God had prophesied. And then, the unthinkable, the unimaginable, the most profound national tragedy occurred. The Ark of God was captured. The Philistine soldiers seized the golden chest, the symbol of God's very presence, and carried it away as the ultimate spoil of war. The news had to be carried back to Shiloh. A man from the tribe of Benjamin fled the battle line and ran all the way to the city, his clothes torn and with dust on his head, the traditional signs of mourning and disaster. As he entered the city and gasped out the news, a great cry of anguish and despair arose from the people. Old Eli was sitting on his seat by the road at the city gate, waiting. The text says his heart trembled for the Ark of God. It's a poignant detail. In his final moments, his primary concern was not for his sons, but for the safety of the Ark. As the runner came near, Eli, now completely blind, asked what the commotion was about. The man rushed to him and said, "I am he who has come from the battle. Israel has fled before the Philistines, and there has also been a great slaughter among the people. Your 2 sons also, Hophni and Phinehas, are dead, and the Ark of God has been captured." The news was delivered in a crushing, escalating sequence of horror. But it was the final blow, the capture of the Ark, that broke the old priest. When the runner mentioned the Ark of God, Eli, top-heavy and frail, fell backward off his chair. He landed hard, his neck snapped, and he died. He had judged Israel for 40 years, and his life ended in a moment of utter national and personal devastation. The tragedy was not over. The wife of Phinehas was pregnant and near the time of her delivery. When she heard the news that her father-in-law was dead, her husband was dead, and the Ark was captured, she went into premature labor. As she was dying, the women attending her tried to comfort her, saying, "Do not be afraid, for you have borne a son." But she did not answer or pay any attention. With her last breath, she gave the boy a name that would forever memorialize the tragedy of that day, Ichabod. And she explained why. "The glory has departed from Israel," she whispered, "for the Ark of God has been captured." For her, and for all of Israel, the loss of the Ark was the loss of everything. It felt as if God himself had abandoned them. Meanwhile, the Philistines were celebrating their greatest victory. They had not only defeated their chief rival, but they had captured their god. They took the ark to Ashdod, one of their 5 major cities, and with great ceremony, they placed it in the temple of their own chief deity, Dagon, setting it up beside the idol. It was the ultimate act of triumph. The God of the Hebrews was now a trophy, paying homage to the victorious Dagon. But the God of Israel is no one's trophy. The next morning, when the people of Ashdod came to their temple, they found a strange sight. The statue of Dagon had fallen from its pedestal and was lying on its face on the ground before the ark of the Lord. It was in a posture of prostration, of worship. A little embarrassed, perhaps, they lifted their god back into its place. The following morning, they returned to find a scene of even greater carnage. Dagon was once again on the ground, prostrate before the ark, but this time, the idol was broken. Its head and both of its hands had been severed and were lying on the threshold of the temple, as if they had been offered as a sacrifice. Only the fishy trunk of the statue remained. The message could not have been clearer. In a direct, head-to-head contest in his own temple, Dagon had been utterly humiliated and dismembered by the silent, golden box. The God of Israel needed no army to fight his battles. The Philistines were about to learn that the ark was more than just a conqueror of idols. The hand of the Lord, the text says, was heavy upon the people of Ashdod. He ravaged them and afflicted them with a plague of tumors. The original Hebrew word is a bit obscure, but many scholars believe this was a form of bubonic plague, a horrific and often fatal disease characterized by painful swellings, or buboes. To make matters worse, some ancient translations of the text add that a plague of mice swarmed over the land, destroying their crops. It was as if the plagues of Egypt were being revisited upon Philistia. The people of Ashdod panicked. They realized this was no coincidence. The ark of the God of Israel must not remain with us, they cried, for his hand is hard against us and against Dagon our God. So they called a meeting of the 5 Philistine lords and decided to move the ark to another city. They sent it to Gath, but the ark's holy contagion traveled with it. As soon as it arrived in Gath, the Lord's hand was against that city, and a very great panic ensued. The plague of tumors broke out among the men of Gath, both young and old. They had imported a divine catastrophe. Terrified, the people of Gath decided to pass the problem along. Their next idea was to send the ark to Ekron. By this point, the ark's reputation had preceded it. When the procession carrying the ark approached the city of Ekron, the people of Ekron cried out in protest. They have brought the ark of the God of Israel to us, to kill us and our people. They knew what had happened in Ashdod and Gath, and they wanted no part of it. But it was too late. The hand of God was very heavy there. The men who did not die were struck with tumors, and the cry of the city went up to heaven. The Philistines had captured the ark, but the ark had taken their entire country hostage. For 7 long months, this divine hot potato was passed from city to city, leaving a trail of death, disease, and terror in its wake. Finally, the Philistine lords had had enough. They called for their priests and their diviners and asked a simple, desperate question. What shall we do with the ark of the Lord? Tell us with what we shall send it to its place. They were no longer thinking about keeping it. They were begging for a way to get rid of it. The priests and diviners, displaying a surprisingly astute, if pagan, understanding of the situation, devised a clever plan. First, they said, you cannot just send it back empty. You must send a guilt offering with it to appease the God of Israel. They recommended making 5 golden tumors and 5 golden mice, one for each of the Philistine lords, as a way of acknowledging the specific plagues that had ravaged them. Give glory to the God of Israel, they advised. Perhaps he will lighten his hand from off you. Then came the test, a brilliant piece of ancient divination designed to prove once and for all whether these plagues were from God or just a terrible coincidence. They were to build a brand new cart, one that had never been used for any other purpose. Then they were to find 2 milk cows, cows that were currently nursing their newborn calves. These cows had never been under a yoke. They were to be hitched to the new cart, and their calves were to be taken from them and penned up back at home. The ark of the Lord, along with a box containing the golden tumors and mice, was to be placed on the cart. Here was the test. A nursing cow's maternal instinct is one of the most powerful forces in nature. Separated from her calf, her every instinct would be to turn around and go home, back to the sound and smell of her hungry baby. Furthermore, an untrained cow that has never been yoked would be unlikely to walk in a straight line. The plan was to simply let the cows go. If they turned and wandered aimlessly, or if they turned back toward home to their calves, then the Philistines could conclude that their suffering had been a matter of chance. But the diviner said, if the cows go straight up the road toward Israelite territory, toward the town of Beth-Shemesh, without turning aside to the right or to the left, then we shall know that it is his hand that struck us. The Philistine lords followed the instructions to the letter. They hitched the 2 nursing cows to the cart and set the ark upon it. They then stood back and watched. It must have been a tense, surreal moment. The 2 cows, lowing as they went, a plaintive cry for the calves they had left behind, did not turn back. They did not wander. Against every natural instinct, they set out on the road and walked in a straight line, directly toward the border of Israel. The 5 Philistine lords, awestruck, followed at a distance all the way to the border of Beth-Shemesh, witnessing the undeniable miracle for themselves. The people of Beth-Shemesh, who were Israelites of the tribe of Judah, were in the valley, harvesting their wheat. They looked up and saw the cart approaching. When they recognized it was the ark, a great wave of joy swept through the field. Their glory had returned. The cart came to a stop in the field of a man named Joshua, a different Joshua from the great leader, beside a large stone. The Levites who lived in the town came and carefully took down the ark of the Lord and the box with the golden offerings. In a spontaneous act of worship, They took the wood of the cart, chopped it up for fuel, and sacrificed the 2 heroic cows as a burnt offering to the Lord. The Philistine lords, having seen enough, turned and went back to Ekron that day. But the story takes one last, tragic turn. The joy of the ark's return quickly turned to a deadly lack of reverence. Perhaps out of curiosity, perhaps out of a sense of relieved familiarity, some of the men of Beth Shemesh committed a terrible sacrilege. They looked inside the ark. They violated the ultimate boundary. They peered into the sacred chest that held the testimony, gazing upon the place only the high priest was ever allowed to see, and only once a year. The consequence was swift and devastating. The holy God who had just rooted the Philistines now struck his own people. The text says the Lord struck down 70 men of the town. The joy in Beth Shemesh turned to mourning and terror. They were confronted with the same terrifying holiness that the Philistines had experienced. Who is able to stand before the Lord, this holy God? They cried out. And to whom shall he go up away from us? They had learned a lesson that Israel had forgotten. God's presence is a consuming fire. It is wonderful, but it is not safe. It cannot be treated casually. Overcome with fear, the men of Beth Shemesh sent messengers to the nearby town of Kiriath-Jearim, saying, "The Philistines have returned the ark of the Lord. Come down and take it up to you." The men of Kiriath-Jearim came, took the ark, and brought it to the house of a man named Abinadab, which was situated on a hill. They consecrated his son, Eleazar, to be its guardian, and there, in a private home in a provincial town, the Ark of the Covenant remained for a long time. The Bible says it was there for 20 years. The central symbol of their faith, the throne of their king, was not in the national sanctuary, but in storage. The glory had returned to Israel, but it was now in a kind of self-imposed exile, waiting for a king, a man after God's own heart, who would finally recognize its importance and bring it out of obscurity and back to the center of the nation's life. For 20 long years, the Ark of the Covenant sat on a hill in the town of Kiriath-Jearim, in the house of a man named Abinadab. 20 years, a generation. Children who were born on the day it arrived were now adults who knew the Ark only as a local landmark, a mysterious, holy object kept under guard in their neighbor's house. The national sanctuary at Shiloh had been destroyed, likely by the Philistines after their great victory at Ebenezer. The priesthood was scattered and in disarray. The unifying symbol of Israel's faith was, for all intents and purposes, in storage. During this time, the prophet Samuel rose to prominence, calling the people to repentance and leading them to a great victory over the Philistines. But as Samuel grew old, the people, looking at the nations around them, began to clamor for a king. They wanted a leader they could see, a king who would march out before them and fight their battles. They were rejecting God as their true king, and despite Samuel's solemn warnings about the dangers of monarchy, the taxes, the conscription, the loss of freedoms, they persisted. "No, but there shall be a king over us," they demanded. And so God gave them a king. His name was Saul. He was from the tribe of Benjamin, and he certainly looked the part. He was tall, handsome, a head taller than any other man in Israel. He was a capable military commander who won significant victories early in his reign. But Saul's heart was not like the ark he ignored, humble wood overlaid with pure gold. Saul's heart was proud, insecure, and prone to disobedience. He was a man who cared more for public opinion than for God's opinion, more for the appearance of piety than for the reality of obedience. And in one of the most telling details of his entire 40-year reign, Saul showed almost no interest whatsoever in the Ark of the Covenant. The sacred chest, the throne of God, the very object that contained the founding documents of their nation, remained in its dusty corner in Kiriath-Jearim. Saul was busy fighting battles, consolidating his kingdom, and nursing his paranoid jealousies. He was a secular king for a people who wanted a secular solution. He established a political capital, but he made no effort to create a spiritual one. For Saul, the presence of God was a convenience to be consulted in a crisis, not a reality to be cherished and dwelled with. The ark was out of sight, and for the king, it was completely out of mind. The spiritual heart of the nation was in a medically induced coma, but while Saul's star was falling, God was preparing a new leader, a shepherd boy from the tribe of Judah, the youngest son of a man named Jesse. His name was David, and he was, in every way that mattered, the anti-Saul. He was not chosen for his height or his appearance, but for his heart. When Samuel went to anoint him, God gave the prophet this timeless principle: "For the Lord sees not as man sees. Man looks on the outward appearance, but the Lord looks on the heart." And David's heart, the Bible tells us, was a heart after God's own. What does that mean? It means that for David, God was not a distant deity or a national symbol. God was his personal reality. You can hear it in the Psalms he wrote, likely composed while watching his sheep under the stars. He saw God's glory in the heavens and his care in the green pastures. God was his rock, his fortress, his deliverer, his shield. David's faith was intimate, passionate, and deeply personal. And when this shepherd poet, this giant slayer, this fugitive who had been hunted like an animal by Saul, finally became king over all Israel, one of his very first priorities was to remedy the spiritual neglect of the previous reign. He knew that for Israel to be truly united and truly blessed, God had to be at the center of their national life. It was time to bring the ark out of exile. David's first move as king of a united Israel was a stroke of strategic genius. He captured the city of Jerusalem. At the time, it was a virtually impregnable fortress held by a Canaanite tribe called the Jebusites, who were so confident in their defenses that they taunted David, saying that even the blind and the lame could fend him off. But David's men found a way in, likely through a water shaft, and took the city. The choice of Jerusalem as his capital was brilliant. It was located on the border between the southern tribe of Judah and the northern tribes, belonging to neither. This made it a neutral, unifying capital, a city that belonged to everyone. He would call it the city of David. But for David, Jerusalem was to be more than just a political and military capital. It was to be a spiritual capital, the earthly home of the great King, the Lord of hosts. His vision was to unite the throne of Israel with the throne of God, to create a kingdom where the earthly king served as the faithful steward of the heavenly King. And to do that, he needed to bring the ark to Jerusalem. This wasn't just a political calculation. It was a passion project, an act of love and devotion from a king who desperately wanted to honor his God. "We must bring the ark of our God to us," David said to his officials, "for we did not inquire of it in the days of Saul." That simple statement was a powerful indictment of the previous 40 years. The nation's spiritual compass had been ignored, and David was determined to correct the course. He began by assembling a massive contingent of 30,000 of the finest men in Israel. This was to be a national event, a celebration of the highest order. A great procession traveled to Kiriath Jearim, to the hill where Abinadab's house stood, the place that had been the ark's quiet home for so long. There was an air of joyous anticipation. The long years of neglect were over. The glory was finally coming home. They came to the house and brought out the ark of God. And here they made their first critical and ultimately fatal mistake. With the best of intentions, they sought to honor the ark by building a brand new cart for it, pulled by oxen. Abinadab's 2 sons, Uzzah and Ahio, were given the honor of guiding the cart, with Ahio walking in front and Uzzah beside it. Now, why a cart? The law of Moses in the book of Numbers was explicitly clear. The ark was holy. It was to be carried on the shoulders of consecrated Levites from the clan of Kohath, using the poles that were never to be removed from its golden rings. So why didn't they do this? Perhaps, after decades of the ark being stationary, the specific instructions had been forgotten, lost in the mists of time. Or more likely, they were simply copying the method the Philistines had used to return the ark. They had seen the new cart and the 2 cows, and they had seen that it arrived safely. They may have reasoned that what was good enough for the pagans must be good enough for them. It was a pragmatic decision, a human solution to a divine requirement. They were treating the ark like a precious piece of furniture to be moved, not as the throne of a dangerously holy God. It was a subtle but profound act of disobedience, born not of malice, but of ignorance and a focus on expediency. But at first, everything seemed fine. The procession set off, and it was a magnificent party. The Bible says David and the entire house of Israel were celebrating before the Lord with all their might. Imagine the sound, the joyful strumming of lyres and harps, the rhythmic beat of tambourines and castanets, the celebratory clash of cymbals. And at the center of it all, David himself, the warrior king, was likely singing and dancing, his heart overflowing with joy. For the first time in his lifetime, the ark was on the move, heading toward the heart of the kingdom. The procession made its way along the dusty road until it reached a place called the thrashing floor of Nacon. A thrashing floor was a hard, flat surface of rock or packed earth where grain was beaten to separate it from the chaff. They were often on windy hilltops, and the ground around them could be uneven. At this spot, the oxen stumbled. The new cart lurched violently, and the ark of God tilted, threatening to slide off. Uzzah, walking beside the cart, saw what was happening. His instincts took over. He was a man who had grown up with the ark in his home. Perhaps the holy fear had been replaced by a comfortable familiarity. Seeing the sacred chest about to fall and be damaged or dishonored, he did the most natural thing in the world. He reached out his hand to steady it. In that instant, the music stopped. The celebration died on the lips of the singers. The Bible says, "The anger of the Lord was kindled against Uzzah, and God struck him down there because of his error, and he died there beside the ark of God." One moment, Uzzah was a faithful guide, a participant in a joyous parade. The next, he was a corpse on the ground. A horrified, deathly silence fell over the procession. The joy of the day curdled into shock and terror. Why? Why would God do this? Uzzah's intention was good. He was trying to protect the ark, to show it respect. From a human perspective, the punishment seems impossibly harsh, a wild overreaction. But Uzzah's death was a terrifying, unforgettable lesson in the holiness of God. The ark was not just a box. It represented the very presence of the transcendent God, who cannot be approached on human terms, with human methods, or with human hands. The command not to touch the ark was an absolute. Uzzah's well-intentioned, reflexive act was a violation of a divine boundary, and the consequence was instantaneous and final. God was reminding Israel in the most shocking way possible that he is not to be managed, controlled, or handled, even for his own good. He is holy. David's reaction was complex and deeply human. First, he was angry. The text says he was angry because the Lord had broken out against Uzzah. Perhaps he was angry at God for what seemed like a cruel and arbitrary act that had ruined his perfect day. Perhaps he was angry at himself for his own failure to prepare properly. And his anger quickly gave way to a profound, holy fear. The ark was no longer a symbol of blessing to be celebrated. It was a source of terrifying, unpredictable power. The project was immediately aborted. The dead end of the procession was even given a name to commemorate the tragedy, Perez Uzzah, which means the breaking out against Uzzah. David, now trembling, looked at the golden chest and asked a question that came from the depths of his terrified heart. How can the ark of the Lord come to me? He felt utterly unworthy and incapable of hosting such a dangerous presence in his city. He was unwilling to take the ark one step further. So he had the ark diverted from its path to Jerusalem and taken to the nearby house of a man named Obed-Edom, who is identified as a Gittite. This likely means he was originally from the Philistine city of Gath, though he was clearly a worshiper of the Lord, possibly a Levite living in a town that had a Philistine history. And there, at the home of Obed-Edom, the ark rested for 3 months, and a wonderful thing happened. The The very presence that had brought death to Uzzah brought life and blessing to the household of Obed-Edom. The Bible says, "The Lord blessed Obed-Edom and all his household." We aren't told the specifics of the blessing. Perhaps his crops flourished, his livestock multiplied, his children were healthy, but the blessing was so abundant and so obvious that news of it traveled all the way to Jerusalem. It was told to King David, "The Lord has blessed the household of Obed-Edom and all that belongs to him because of the Ark of God." This news was a turning point for David. It taught him a vital lesson. The Ark was not inherently a source of destruction. Its presence was a source of immense blessing if it was treated with the proper reverence and respect. The problem wasn't with the Ark. The problem had been with how they had approached the Ark. The fear in David's heart began to be replaced by a renewed desire. His passion for God's presence was rekindled, but this time it was tempered with a healthy, reverent fear and a new determination to do things God's way. So David resolved to try again. But this time, there would be no shortcuts, no new carts, no pragmatic human inventions. This time, they would do it by the book. David had clearly spent the last 3 months studying the law. He gathers the leaders of Israel and declares, "No one may carry the Ark of God, but the Levites, for the Lord chose them to carry the Ark of the Lord and to minister to him forever." He summons the priests, the descendants of Aaron, and the chiefs of the Levites. He tells them to consecrate themselves, to go through the sacred rituals of purification, to prepare to handle the holy object. He gives them a direct and humble admission of their previous failure. "Because you did not carry it the first time, the Lord our God broke out against us, because we did not seek him according to the rule." It was a public confession of their sin of presumption. This time, David organizes everything with meticulous care. He appoints Levite singers and musicians with cymbals, harps, and lyres to raise sounds of joy. This was not just going to be a correct procession. It was still going to be a joyful one. The day came to bring the Ark from the house of Obed-Edom. With great reverence, the consecrated Levites entered the house. They didn't load it onto a cart. They stooped, slid the golden poles onto their shoulders, and lifted their sacred burden. The weight was not just physical. It was the weight of glory, the weight of responsibility. The procession began, and after the Levites had taken the first 6 steps, a critical moment, the procession paused. David offered sacrifices of an ox and a fattened animal. This was a profound act of worship. It was an acknowledgement that their progress was dependent not on their own strength, but on God's grace. It was a plea for atonement, a recognition of their need for forgiveness before they could proceed. And then, with the procession successfully underway, the joy that had been so horrifically cut short 3 months earlier erupted once more. But this time, it was a purer, deeper, more reverent joy. And at the heart of it was the king himself. David had taken off his royal robes and was wearing a simple linen ephod. This was the garment typically worn by priests. By wearing it, David was identifying not as a king standing above his people, but as a priest standing with them, a fellow worshiper leading them into the presence of God. And then he began to dance. The Bible says he danced before the Lord with all his might. This was not a refined, choreographed courtly dance. This was an act of ecstatic, uninhibited, passionate worship. He was leaping, whirling, celebrating with every fiber of his being, holding nothing back. He was a king completely overcome with love and joy for his God, and he didn't care who was watching. The whole procession made its way toward Jerusalem with shouts of joy, with the triumphant blast of the shofar, the ram's horn, and with the sound of music filling the air. But not everyone was celebrating. As the parade entered the city of David, Saul's daughter Michal, who was David's first wife, was watching from a palace window. She had grown up in the court of a king who valued his dignity above all else. She saw her husband, the king of Israel, the man who was supposed to be the image of royal decorum, leaping and dancing like a common man, exposing himself in his simple ephod. And the text says that when she saw him, she despised him in her heart. She couldn't understand this kind of undignified, emotional display. To her, it looked foolish and shameful. Unaware of her contempt, the joyful procession continued. They brought the ark into the city and placed it inside the special tent that David had prepared for it. The ark was finally home. David, acting as the nation's priest king, offered burnt offerings and peace offerings before the Lord. He then turned and blessed the people in the name of the Lord of hosts. And he threw a great feast for the entire nation, giving every man and woman a loaf of bread, a portion of meat, and a cake of raisins. It was a day of unparalleled national joy and spiritual renewal. When the festivities were over, David returned to his palace to bless his own household. But he was met with the cold, dripping sarcasm of his wife, Michal. "How the king of Israel honored himself today," she sneered, "uncovering himself today before the eyes of his servants' female servants, as one of the vulgar fellows shamelessly uncovers himself." She shamed him for his passion, for his lack of royal composure. David's response was immediate and powerful. His joy did not turn to shame, but to a righteous defense of his worship. It was before the Lord, he declared, pinning the reason for his dance directly on its intended audience. He reminds her that it was the Lord who chose him over her father, Saul, and his entire house. "I will celebrate before the Lord," he continues, doubling down on his actions. And then he makes a remarkable statement. "I will become even more undignified than this, and I will be humiliated in my own eyes. But by the female servants of whom you have spoken, by them I shall be held in honor." He was drawing a clear line. His worship was for an audience of one. He would rather be seen as a fool by the proud and dignified and be honored by the humble, because he knew he was honoring his God. The confrontation created a permanent rift between them, and the Bible adds a sad, final note to Michal's story. "And Michal, the daughter of Saul, had no child to the day of her death." Her cynical, barren heart led to a barren womb. Sometime later, with the ark safely housed in its tent and the kingdom at peace, David was sitting in his own beautiful palace, a house built of fragrant cedar wood from Lebanon, and a holy sense of discontent settled upon him. "See now," he said to Nathan the prophet, "I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwells in a tent." The contrast bothered him deeply. He, the earthly king, lived in a permanent, beautiful structure, while the throne of the heavenly king was housed in a temporary, portable shelter. It didn't seem right. He wanted to build a house for God, a magnificent temple that would give the ark a permanent, glorious home. Nathan, hearing the king's pious desire, gave his immediate approval. "Go, do all that is in your heart, for the Lord is with you." But that very night, God intervened. The word of the Lord came to Nathan with a different message for David, a message that would turn David's plan completely on its head. God's message was gentle but firm. "Are you the one to build me a house to dwell in?" God asks. He reminds David that since the day he brought Israel out of Egypt, he has never dwelled in a house, but has always moved about with them in a tent and a tabernacle. He had never asked any of the previous leaders to build him a house of cedar. And then God makes a stunning reversal. "The Lord declares to you," Nathan is to tell David, "that the Lord will make you a house." David wanted to build a house for God, but God was going to build a house, a dynasty for David. God makes a deep and unconditional covenant with his servant. He promises to make David's name great. He promises to give his people Israel a permanent, secure home. And then the ultimate promise: when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. This was a promise that went far beyond David's son, Solomon. It was a messianic promise. God was promising David an eternal dynasty, an eternal kingdom, an eternal throne. While Solomon would be the one to build the physical temple, a greater son of David would one day come to build an eternal kingdom. David's passionate, heartfelt, and ultimately obedient quest to honor the ark had resulted in God bestowing upon him one of the greatest and most far-reaching promises in the entire Bible. The ark was now in its rightful place, at the center of the nation's worship, and the stage was set for the final, glorious chapter of its biblical journey: the building of the great temple that would be its last known home. The long and turbulent reign of King David was drawing to a close. The shepherd boy who had become a giant slayer, a poet, a fugitive, and a king was now an old man, frail and cold in his bed. He had fought the Lord's battles, united the 12 tribes into a single, powerful nation, and established Jerusalem as its eternal capital. He had made his share of terrible mistakes, and his own family life had been scarred by tragedy and betrayal. But through it all, his heart had remained passionately devoted to his God. And there was one last piece of business, one great, unfulfilled dream that he needed to pass on to his son and successor, Solomon. David, the man of war, had not been permitted to build God a permanent house. His hands had shed too much blood. That sacred task was reserved for his son, Solomon, whose name itself meant peace. But David, in his final years, did everything in his power to ensure the project's success. He became the great fundraiser and quartermaster for the future temple. He poured his own vast personal fortune into the project and called upon the leaders of Israel to contribute generously as well. And they did, giving gold, silver, bronze, iron, precious stones, and fine wood in staggering quantities. A freewill offering that echoed the generosity of their ancestors who had built the tabernacle in the wilderness. But David provided more than just the materials. In one of his final acts, he gave Solomon the actual blueprint, the architectural plans for the temple. And he makes a remarkable claim about these plans. They were not of his own design. All this, David said, the Lord made me understand in writing by his hand upon me. All the work of this plan. Just as Moses had received the divine pattern for the tabernacle on Mount Sinai, David had received the divine pattern for the temple. He then charged his son in the presence of all of Israel, "Be strong and courageous, and do it. Do not be afraid, and do not be dismayed, for the Lord God, my God, is with you. He will not leave you or forsake you until all the work for the service of the house of the Lord is finished." With David's death, the golden age of Israel truly began under the reign of King Solomon. He was a man blessed with supernatural wisdom, a diplomat, an administrator, and a builder. His kingdom was peaceful and fabulously wealthy. And in the 4th year of his reign, he began the monumental task his father had prepared for him, the construction of the temple. The chosen site was itself sacred ground. It was to be built on Mount Moriah, the very mountain where 1,000 years earlier, Abraham had been prepared to offer his son Isaac, the place where God had provided a substitute sacrifice. More recently, it was the site of the thrashing floor of Ornan, the Jebusite, where David had seen the angel of the Lord and offered a sacrifice that had stopped a devastating plague. It was a place forever associated with sacrifice, redemption, and the meeting of heaven and earth. The scale of the project was unlike anything Israel had ever seen. Solomon entered into a trade alliance with his neighbor, Hiram, the king of the Phoenician city of Tyre. Hiram would provide the finest building materials in the world, the legendary cedars of Lebanon, giant, fragrant, and durable trees, as well as cypress wood. In exchange, Solomon would provide wheat and olive oil. To accomplish this, Solomon conscripted tens of thousands of laborers. 30,000 Israelites were sent to Lebanon in rotating shifts of 10,000 a month. Another 70,000 served as carriers, and 80,000 as stonecutters in the mountains. This was a national effort on an epic scale. Imagine the scene: the great forests of Lebanon ringing with the sound of axes, massive logs being floated down the Mediterranean coast in great rafts to the port of Joppa, then hauled by thousands of men on the long, uphill journey to Jerusalem. And in the quarries near the city, the stonecutters were at work. The Bible adds a fascinating and beautiful detail to their labor. All the stones for the temple were quarried and cut to their exact, finished dimensions right there in the quarry. Then they were transported to the building site and fitted into place. The result was that during the 7 years of the temple's construction, no hammer or axe or any tool of iron was heard in the house while it was being built. The temple rose on Mount Moriah in a kind of reverent silence, growing organically from the earth as if by a divine hand, without the violent clang of human tools. The structure itself, while not enormous by the standards of a modern cathedral, was a masterpiece of craftsmanship and opulent beauty. The interior was a jewel box of gold and carved wood. The walls and floors were paneled with fragrant cedar and cypress, so that no stone was visible on the inside. And then, every single surface, the walls, the floor, the ceiling, was overlaid with pure, shining gold. The entire interior glowed with a warm, golden light, and everywhere there were carvings. The walls were intricately engraved with figures of cherubim, tall, graceful palm trees, and blooming flowers. It was a kind of artistic recreation of the Garden of Eden, a perfect, golden paradise where God could walk among his people. The main hall, the holy place, contained the golden altar of incense, the golden table for the bread of the presence, and 10 large golden lampstands, 5 on each side, that would have filled the room with light. But it was the innermost sanctuary, the Holy of Holies, the Debir in Hebrew, that received the most lavish attention. It was a perfect cube, just like in the tabernacle, but its walls, floor, and ceiling were completely covered in the purest gold. And inside this golden cube, Solomon placed 2 new, magnificent guardians. They were 2 colossal cherubim, each standing 15 feet tall, carved from olive wood and overlaid with gold. They were positioned side by side in the center of the room, their combined wingspan stretching 30 feet, the entire width of the chamber. 1 wing of each cherub touched the outer wall, and their other 2 wings met in the very center of the room, forming a golden canopy of protection. They stood facing forward, their powerful, angelic forms ready to receive the one object for which this entire glorious structure had been built. After 7 years of silent, sacred construction, the house of the Lord was finished. All that remained was to bring the glory home. Solomon sent out a decree, summoning the elders, the tribal heads, and the leaders of all Israel to Jerusalem for a great festival of dedication. The time had come to bring the Ark of the Covenant up from the city of David, where it had rested for decades in a simple tent, and install it in its final, permanent home. A great procession, grander than any that had come before, was formed. The priests and the Levites went to the tent and reverently lifted the ark onto their shoulders. They also brought the rest of the sacred furnishings of the old tabernacle. The destination was just a short walk up the hill from the city of David to Mount Moriah. But it was the final leg of a journey that had begun centuries before at the foot of Mount Sinai. As they walked, King Solomon and the entire congregation of Israel offered sacrifices of sheep and oxen that were so numerous, the Bible says, they could not be told or numbered. It was an extravagant, overwhelming outpouring of thanksgiving and worship. The priests carried the ark on its golden poles into the temple, through the holy place, and behind the great, ornate veil into the perfect, golden silence of the Holy of Holies. They carefully positioned it on the floor, directly beneath the sheltering wings of the two giant olive wood cherubim. The ark that had wandered for so long, that had been captured, neglected, and feared, was finally at rest. The Bible adds a small but significant detail. When the priests set it down, the long carrying poles were positioned in such a way that their ends could just be seen from the holy place, a subtle reminder of its history as a traveler. And the narrator of Kings makes a point to say that at this time, there was nothing in the ark except the 2 tablets of stone that Moses put there at Horeb. The pot of manna and Aaron's rod that had once accompanied it were now gone, lost to history. Only the covenant itself remained. And then the moment of divine confirmation came. As the last of the priests backed out of the sanctuary, the temple was suddenly filled with a cloud. It was the same cloud that had descended on the tabernacle in the wilderness, the physical manifestation of God's presence and glory, the Shekinah. The cloud was so thick, so radiant, so overwhelming, that the priests could not even remain inside to perform their duties. God had moved in. He had accepted their offering. He had filled their house with his glory. As the cloud filled the temple, Solomon turned and blessed the people, and then he stood before the great altar and offered one of the longest and most beautiful prayers recorded in the entire Bible. It is a masterpiece of faith and theology. He begins by acknowledging the profound paradox of what he has just done. But will God indeed dwell on the earth? He asks. Behold, heaven and the highest heaven cannot contain you. How much less this house that I have built? He understood that the magnificent temple was not a box to contain God, but a point of contact, a place where God had graciously agreed to put his name. He then prays that the temple would be a house of prayer, a place of forgiveness and restoration for the people of Israel. He prays that when they sin and are defeated by their enemies, if they turn back toward this temple and pray, God would hear from heaven and forgive them. He prays that in times of drought or famine or plague, if they spread their hands toward this house, God would hear and heal their land. He even prays for the foreigner, the non-Israelite who comes from a distant land, because he has heard of God's great name. When that foreigner comes and prays toward this temple, Solomon asks, "Here in heaven your dwelling place, and do according to all for which the foreigner calls to you, in order that all the peoples of the earth may know your name and fear you." It was a prayer with a stunningly global vision. When Solomon finished his prayer, a second great sign of God's approval was given. Fire flashed down from heaven and consumed the burnt offerings and the sacrifices on the altar. And once again, the glory of the Lord filled the temple so powerfully that the priests could not enter. When all the people of Israel saw the fire and the glory, they fell on their faces to the pavement and worshipped, crying out, "For he is good, for his steadfast love endures forever." The celebration lasted for 14 days, the greatest spiritual high point in the history of the nation. The Ark of the Covenant was now enshrined in unimaginable splendor at the heart of a vibrant kingdom, at peace. And then, after this glorious climax, the story of the Ark goes almost completely silent. For the next 400 years, it is presumed to be resting in the Holy of Holies as the history of Israel unfolds. And that history is largely a story of slow decline. After Solomon's death, his own heart having been turned away by his many foreign wives and their idols, the kingdom was torn in two. The 10 northern tribes formed the kingdom of Israel, and the 2 southern tribes formed the kingdom of Judah, with Jerusalem as its capital. A long succession of kings, some good, some wicked, sat on the throne of David in Jerusalem. Some of them, like the evil King Manasseh, so desecrated the temple that they set up pagan idols within its sacred courts. It's possible that during these dark times, faithful priests removed the Ark from the Holy of Holies and hid it for safekeeping. We get a hint of this during the reign of one of Judah's last good kings, Josiah, around 621 BC. As part of his great reforms, Josiah gives an order to the Levites: "Put the holy ark in the house that Solomon the son of David, king of Israel, built. You need not carry it on your shoulders anymore." The command suggests the ark had been moved and was now being formally returned to its proper place. And that is the last time the Ark of the Covenant is ever mentioned in the historical narrative of the Bible. After Josiah's command, it vanishes from the record. A few decades later, the end came for Jerusalem. In 586 BC, the mighty Babylonian Empire, under its king Nebuchadnezzar, conquered the city after a long and brutal siege. They did what, for centuries, had seemed impossible. They destroyed the Temple of Solomon. They burned it to the ground, tore down the walls of Jerusalem, and carried off its treasures and its people into exile in Babylon. The Bible gives detailed, heartbreaking inventories of the sacred items the Babylonians plundered. They list the great bronze pillars, the bronze sea, the basins, the shovels, the fire pans, and all the vessels of gold and silver. But in these meticulous lists of looted treasures, one item is conspicuously absent. There is no mention of the Ark of the Covenant. So what happened to it? This is one of the greatest and most enduring mysteries in all of history, and it has given rise to centuries of searching, speculation, and legend. The most straightforward, and for many historians, the most likely theory is that it was simply destroyed. It may have been broken up by the Babylonians for its valuable gold and the wood used for fuel, and simply wasn't considered significant enough to be listed alongside the massive bronze works. Or it may have been destroyed in the great fire that consumed the temple. For all its spiritual significance, it was still a physical object, and it may have met a mundane and unrecorded end. But the silence of the inventories has led many to believe it was not destroyed, but hidden. A very old and powerful tradition is recorded in the apocryphal book of 2nd Maccabees, written a few centuries before Christ. It tells the story of the prophet Jeremiah, who was ministering in Jerusalem just before the Babylonian invasion. According to this account, Jeremiah, acting on a divine warning, took the ark, the tent of meeting, and the altar of incense, and hid them in a cave on Mount Nebo, the very mountain from which Moses had viewed the promised land. The story says Jeremiah sealed the entrance and told his followers that the location must remain unknown until God gathers his people together again and shows his mercy. It's a beautiful and poignant story of the ark waiting in a hidden place for a future day of redemption. Another set of theories suggests that faithful priests, seeing the Babylonians were coming, smuggled the ark out of Jerusalem and took it on a long journey to safety. The most famous and elaborate of these traditions belongs to the Ethiopian Orthodox Tewahedo Church. Their national epic, the Kebra the Glory of Kings, tells a very different story. They believe the ark left Jerusalem not in the time of Jeremiah, but centuries earlier, during the reign of Solomon himself. According to their tradition, the famous Queen of Sheba who visited Solomon was the Queen of Ethiopia. She and Solomon had a son named Menelik. When Menelik grew to be a young man, he traveled to Jerusalem to meet his father. When it was time for him to return to Ethiopia, a group of the firstborn sons of the Israelite elders were sent to accompany him. Unbeknownst to Solomon, these men, unhappy about leaving Jerusalem, decided to take the most important thing in Israel with them, the Ark of the Covenant. They secretly stole the true Ark from the Holy of Holies and left a brilliant forgery in its place. Menelik, they claim, brought the Ark to Ethiopia, where it became the center of their faith. To this day, the Ethiopian Orthodox Church claims that the original Ark of the Covenant rests in the chapel of the tablet at the Church of Our Lady Mary of Zion in the city of Axum. It is guarded by a single, consecrated monk, who is the only person on earth allowed to see it. He is known as the guardian of the Ark, and he never leaves the chapel grounds until he names his successor on his deathbed. It is an extraordinary claim, a story of faith and national identity that has been preserved for millennia. Other legends are even more speculative. Some have suggested it was buried in a secret chamber deep beneath the Temple Mount in Jerusalem, where it remains to this day. Some have proposed it was taken to a Jewish colony in Egypt. And of course, in modern times, it has become the ultimate prize in adventure stories, sought by everyone from the Knights Templar to Indiana Jones. But perhaps the most profound answer to the question of the Ark's disappearance is not historical, but theological. Perhaps it disappeared from the story because its role was complete. The Ark was a physical object for a physical people, a necessary but temporary symbol of God's presence. Its most important feature was the mercy seat, the golden lid where the blood of atonement was sprinkled once a year. It was a beautiful, powerful shadow of a greater reality to come. When Jesus Christ died on the cross, the New Testament tells us that the great, thick veil of the temple in Jerusalem, the curtain that separated the holy place from the Holy of Holies, was torn in two, from top to bottom. It was a divine sign that the barrier between God and humanity had been removed. The way into the true Holy of Holies, into the very presence of God, was now open to all, not through a Levitical priest, but through the sacrifice of Jesus, the great high priest. The writer of the book of Hebrews argues that the ark and the temple were just copies and shadows of the true heavenly sanctuary. The ultimate mercy seat, the ultimate place of atonement, is not a slab of gold, but Christ himself. The prophet Jeremiah, who may have witnessed the ark's final days, looked forward to a time when it would no longer be needed. In those days, the Lord says through him, they shall no longer say, the ark of the covenant of the Lord. It shall not come to mind, or be remembered, or missed. It shall not be made again. He was prophesying a new covenant, where God's law would be written not on tablets of stone inside a golden box, but on the human heart. And finally, in the very last book of the Bible, the book of Revelation, the Apostle John is given a vision of the end of all things, a vision of a new heaven and a new earth. He sees the holy city, the New Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven from God. And he makes a remarkable observation. And I saw no temple in the city, for its temple is the Lord God, the Almighty, and the Lamb. In the final, perfect state of things, there is no need for a temple, no need for an ark, because God's presence is no longer confined to a single spot. He dwells with his people directly, fully, and forever. The journey of the Ark of the Covenant is the story of God's desire to be with his people. From a blueprint given in fire on a terrifying mountain, to a silent witness in the heart of a bustling kingdom, to a glorious throne in a golden temple, and finally, into the quiet mystery of its disappearance. It served its purpose perfectly, a constant, tangible reminder of the covenant, the holiness, and the breathtaking mercy of God. And its very absence now points us toward a greater truth, that the glory of God is no longer housed in a box of wood and gold, but is available to all who seek him, dwelling in the hearts of those who have been made a temple of his Holy Spirit.